The last light of the sun lay upon the water like molten copper, stretching long and still between the green banks of the great river. A single felucca drifted southward on the current, its triangular sail slack in the windless dusk, the wooden hull creaking softly with each lazy swell. The merchant Kimwasid sat upon a folded linen cloth near the stern, one hand trailing in the Nile's warmth, watching the day surrender to the vast Egyptian night. Around him, the world grew quiet. The calls of ibis faded into the papyrus marshes. The distant lowing of cattle settled into silence. And the river, eternal and unhurried, carried the small vessel onward through the deepening blue. The air smelled of wet earth and lotus blossoms, that particular fragrance that belongs only to the Nile at evening, when the heat of the day releases its grip upon the land and the cooler breath of night begins to rise from the water. Along the western bank, palm trees stood in dark silhouette against the fading amber sky, their fronds motionless, like sentinels watching over the passage of time itself. A heron lifted from the shallows with a slow, deliberate wing beat, its grey form dissolving into the gathering dusk. Kimwasid had made this journey many times before. From the great city of Thebes, with its towering temples and bustling markets, southward toward the quarries of Aswan, where granite the color of rose petals waited to be shaped into monuments that would outlast 1,000 generations. But tonight, there was no urgency in his passage. The cargo of fine linen and cedarwood oil had been loaded at dawn, and the river's current was doing the work of 10 oarsmen. There was nothing to do but rest and watch, and let the Nile carry him where it would. The boatman, a weathered man named Senefer, whose skin was the deep brown of aged acacia wood, steered with a long oar from the stern, making small adjustments that barely disturbed the water's surface. He hummed a song so old that its words had been forgotten, leaving only the melody, a rising and falling tune that matched the rhythm of the current. His bare feet were planted firmly on the deck, and his eyes read the river with the ease of a scribe reading papyrus. Every sandbar, every eddy, every subtle change in the water's color told him something. The sky above had deepened from amber to violet, and now the first stars appeared, faint and tentative, as though testing whether the sun had truly gone. In Egypt, the stars were not merely lights in the darkness. They were the souls of the blessed dead, the spirits of pharaohs and sages who had completed their journey through the underworld and now sailed in their own celestial barks across the body of the sky goddess Nut. Kimwasid watched them emerge one by one, each new pinprick of light adding to the great tapestry that arched from horizon to horizon. The river widened here, and the banks drew back into soft grey distance. On the eastern shore, a small village appeared, its mud brick houses golden in the light of oil lamps that flickered behind open doorways. The smell of baking bread drifted across the water, mingling with the sweeter scent of burning acacia charcoal. A dog barked once, twice, then fell silent. Children's laughter rose briefly and was swallowed by the night. The village was settling into sleep, as it had settled every evening for 1,000 years, secure in the knowledge that the river would still be there come morning. The felucca passed the village and entered a stretch of river bordered by tall stands of papyrus, their feathered heads nodding gently in some imperceptible breeze. Frogs had begun their evening chorus, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the marshes themselves were breathing. Fireflies danced among the papyrus stems, their cold green light tracing brief and random patterns in the darkness. Kimwasid watched them with half-closed eyes, lulled by the gentle motion of the boat and the steady, repetitive music of the frogs. He thought of the goods he carried. The linen was from the temple workshops of Karnak, woven so finely that a whole bolt could pass through a man's ring. The cedarwood oil had come by caravan from the distant mountains of Lebanon, crossing the desert in sealed alabaster jars to preserve its fragrance. In Aswan, these treasures would be traded for blocks of pink granite and jars of gold dust washed from the river's upper reaches. It was a trade as old as the kingdom itself, following routes that had been established when the pyramids were young. But commerce felt distant now, abstract, belonging to the world of daylight and calculation. Here on the river at night, there was only the water, and the stars, and the gentle forward motion of the boat. The world had contracted to this small circle of perception, this bubble of warmth and quiet drifting through the Egyptian darkness. And it was enough. It was more than enough. A temple appeared on the western bank, rising from the river's edge like a dream made solid in stone. Its massive pylons were pale in the starlight, their surfaces covered in carved reliefs that Kimwasit could not see from this distance but knew by heart. Stories of gods and pharaohs, of battles won and offerings made, of the eternal cycle of flood and harvest that sustained all life along the river. Torches burned in bronze brackets flanking the entrance, their light catching the gold leaf that adorned the great wooden doors. A priest moved between the torches, a dim figure in white linen, performing the evening rituals that ensured the sun would rise again come morning. The sound of a sistrum carried across the water, its metallic shimmer rising and falling in a rhythm that was both ancient and hypnotic. It was the sound of Hathor, goddess of joy and music, whose temple this must be. The rattle of bronze discs on their metal frame created a sound unlike any other, a bright and shivering tone that seemed to hang in the air long after each shake had ended. Kimwasit listened as the temple slowly passed from view, the sound of the sistrum growing fainter until it was indistinguishable from the whisper of water along the hull. Senefer adjusted the steering oar and the boat curved gently away from the western bank, finding the deeper channel where the current ran strongest. The river was nearly black now, its surface reflecting the stars so perfectly that it seemed as though the Felucca sailed through the sky itself, suspended between two infinite fields of light. Above and below, the same stars shimmered, and only the occasional ripple from a surfacing fish broke the illusion. The night had fully settled now, and with it came a profound stillness that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the desert beyond the river's green margins. In the distance, far to the west, the great pyramids of an ancient necropolis rose against the stars, their geometric perfection visible even in silhouette. They had stood there for over 1,000 years already, and would stand for thousands more, patient and immovable, watching over the passage of dynasties and the slow accumulation of sand at their bases. Kimwasit thought of the men who had built them, generation after generation of workers hauling stone and mixing mortar under the same sun that had warmed his own face that morning. They were gone now, all of them, returned to the earth that had sustained them. But their work remained, as permanent as anything human hands had ever created. There was a comfort in that thought, a reassurance that some things endure beyond the brief span of a single life. The air had cooled noticeably, and Kimwasit drew his linen cloak more tightly around his shoulders. The fabric was soft from many washings, its weave loose enough to breathe but dense enough to hold his warmth close to his body. He shifted his position, settling more deeply into the cushions that lined the boat's low stern, and let his gaze drift upward to the river of stars that the priests called the celestial Nile. It was said that the sky was a mirror of the earth, that every river and mountain below had its counterpart above. The great band of light that stretched across the heavens was the Nile's reflection, carrying the blessed dead on their eternal journey just as the earthly river carried the living. Kinwasit found this idea deeply satisfying, this sense of connection between the world he could touch and the world that existed beyond the reach of mortal hands. It made the darkness feel less like an absence and more like a presence, a living thing that held secrets and stories of its own. A gentle splash broke the silence, and Kinwasit turned to see the rippling circles where a Nile perch had surfaced to take an insect from the air. The circles spread outward in perfect concentricity, catching the starlight on their diminishing crests before dissolving back into stillness. Life continued beneath the river's surface, a whole world of creatures going about their nocturnal business, unaware of the small wooden vessel passing above them. Sennefer had produced a small oil lamp from somewhere within the boat's modest cabin, and its warm yellow glow now illuminated a small circle of deck around him. He set it in a niche cut into the steering post, where its light would not blind him to the river ahead but would provide just enough illumination to see the ropes and fittings of his craft. His humming had grown softer, barely audible above the sound of water, a lullaby for the boat itself. The hours passed without urgency, measured not by any mechanical device but by the slow rotation of the stars overhead. Orion rose in the east, his belt of 3 bright stars climbing above the palm-fringed horizon. The Egyptians knew him as Osiris, lord of the underworld, husband of Isis, father of Horus. His appearance in the sky marked the beginning of a new season, a celestial clock that had regulated planting and harvest since the first seeds were pressed into the Nile's rich black soil. Along the riverbank, date palms cast long shadows in the starlight, their clusters of fruit hanging heavy and dark beneath the fronds. In a few weeks, workers would climb the tall trunks with practiced ease, cutting the clusters free and lowering them in baskets to waiting hands below. The dates would be dried in the sun, packed in reed baskets, and sent by boat to markets throughout the kingdom. But for now, they hung undisturbed, ripening slowly in the warm nights. The Felucca passed beneath a rocky outcrop where the desert cliff came close to the river, its face carved with ancient inscriptions left by travelers who had passed this way in centuries past. Kinwasit could not read them in the darkness, but he knew they were there, scratched into the stone by merchants and soldiers and pilgrims who had felt the need to mark their passage, to say to the future, "I was here, I existed, I traveled this river under these same stars." A cooling breeze finally stirred from the north, barely strong enough to lift the sail's heavy fabric but sufficient to carry new scents across the water. The dry, mineral smell of the desert mixed with something sweeter, perhaps the night-blooming flowers that grew in the gardens of some unseen estate set back from the river. The Egyptians were great lovers of gardens, surrounding their homes with carefully tended plots of flowers, vegetables, and fruit trees, creating small oases of green abundance in the narrow fertile strip between river and desert. Kinwasit's eyelids had grown heavy, his body surrendering to the gentle rocking of the boat and the soothing constancy of the river's sound. It was a sound that had no beginning and no end, the eternal murmur of water finding its way to the sea, carrying silt from the distant mountains of the south to spread across the floodplain in annual renewal. Every farmer in Egypt owed his livelihood to this sound, this endless motion of water bearing the gift of fertile earth. He dozed for a time, dipping in and out of sleep like the boat dipping on small swells, his dreams merging seamlessly with the waking world around him. In his dreams, the boat sailed upward into the sky, joining the celestial barks of the gods on their nightly voyage across the body of Nut. The stars were close enough to touch, warm as embers, and the river below shrank to a silver thread winding through a darkened land. When he opened his eyes again, the eastern sky had changed. The stars there seemed fewer, dimmer, as though withdrawing before some approaching light. The air was cooler still, carrying the distinctive chill that comes just before dawn in the desert, when the earth has radiated away all the warmth it stored during the previous day and the sun has not yet begun its work of warming it again. A thin mist lay upon the water, clinging to the surface in wisps and tendrils that curled around the boat's hull. Sennefer was still at his post, still humming his ancient melody, still making those small and careful adjustments to the steering oar. He seemed as much a part of the boat as the mast or the deck planks, rooted and permanent, a man so perfectly suited to his work that the boundary between the sailor and his vessel had long since dissolved. He noticed Kinwasit stirring and nodded toward the eastern bank, where the first grey light of pre-dawn was beginning to define the shapes of palms and buildings. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, its voice thin and reedy across the water. Then another answered from further away, and another still, a chain of calls spreading along the river valley like a message passed from village to village. The world was waking. A fisherman appeared at the water's edge, ankle-deep in the shallows, casting his net in a wide arc that settled on the river's surface with barely a sound. His movements were unhurried, practiced, the gestures of a man who had performed this same action every dawn for decades. The sky brightened steadily, moving through shades of grey to pearl to the palest gold. The mist began to lift from the water, rising in slow columns that caught the first light and glowed with an interior luminescence. Through the dissolving haze, the landscape emerged in layers, each plane of distance revealing itself in succession, the near bank first, sharp and detailed, then the far bank, softer and more muted, then the distant cliffs of the desert, pale and immense against the brightening sky. And then the sun appeared, rising above the eastern desert in a blaze of red and gold that set the entire river aflame with color. The water, which had been black and silver through the night, was suddenly transformed into a ribbon of liquid gold stretching from horizon to horizon. The palm trees stood in sharp silhouette, their fronds catching the first warmth with a gentle rustling that had been absent through the stillness of the night. Birds erupted from the papyrus marshes in great flocks, their wings catching the new light as they wheeled above the river in patterns of chaotic grace. Kinwasit watched the sunrise with the same quiet attention he had given the stars. It was the same miracle that occurred every morning, the same triumph of Ra over the serpent of darkness, and yet it never lost its power to move him. The world made new. The river continuing its endless journey. The boat carrying him southward toward another day of life and work and wonder. He drew a deep breath of the cool morning air, tasting moisture and earth and the faint sweetness of dew on growing things. Ahead, the river curved around a broad bend, and beyond it, the first buildings of a larger town appeared, white-walled and gleaming in the early light. Smoke rose from breakfast fires, and the sound of voices carried across the water, the daily business of Egyptian life resuming after its nightly pause. Donkeys brayed in courtyards. Children ran down to the river's edge to wash and splash. A woman walked with a water jar balanced perfectly on her head, her steps measured and graceful along the worn path that led from the town to the water's edge. Sennefer guided the felucca toward a wooden jetty that extended into the current. It was time to rest, to eat, to let the sun warm the deck before continuing the journey southward. But there was no hurry. The river would still be there, patient and eternal, ready to carry them onward whenever they chose to resume their voyage. The Nile asked nothing of those who traveled upon it. It simply flowed, as it had flowed since the beginning of all things, a silver road winding through the heart of the ancient land, connecting past to present to future in one unbroken current of water and time and memory. The boat bumped gently against the jetty's pilings, and Sennefer wrapped a rope around the nearest post with the easy confidence of long practice. The journey would continue later. But for now, there was the warmth of the new sun on tired shoulders, the smell of fresh bread from the town above, and the knowledge that the river would keep its own counsel until they were ready to listen again. The Nile had waited for them through the night. It would wait a little longer still. And so the morning settled over the river valley like a blessing, golden and warm and full of gentle promise. The stars had faded, but they would return. The darkness had retreated, but it would come again. And when it did, the river would still be there, still flowing, still carrying its ancient burden of silt and memory southward toward the sea. This was the eternal rhythm of Egypt, the pulse that had sustained a civilization for 3,000 years, and would sustain it for 3,000 more. The river endured. The river remembered. And in its patient, ceaseless flow, there was a peace that surpassed all understanding, a calm that reached back to the very beginning of time and stretched forward into an eternity that no human mind could compass. Kimwasit stepped from the boat onto the worn stones of the jetty, his legs adjusting to the solidity of land after the gentle motion of the water. He turned once to look back at the river, shimmering now in full morning light, and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had been carried safely through the night by something far older and wiser than himself. The Nile flowed on. It always had. It always would. And in that simple, eternal truth, there was rest enough for any weary soul.